I would say one of the primary differences between the two things are that app developers are very focused on the user interface. They want to use the native widgets, they want the native look and feel, right? All these things. So, one question that is very good when considering cross-platform tools and support is, should cross-platform apps adapt to their target's look and feel, or should the apps adopt a consistent look across platforms?
I can take that from the Microsoft. From the Microsoft perspective, one of the key differentiators for our platform is the look and feel. You know, what was the Metro UI, now is the Windows Store UI. It's a distinctive way that we want to present the applications to users. So, from that perspective, we want the best native experience with the best native UI.
So, from a research perspective, I'm going to give you some numbers. To start with, so we publish, well, those that don't know, we publish this Developer Economics, biggest, most global developer survey. The last one was released 2 weeks ago, it's a free download. We looked at cross-platform tools. And among the reasons why developers use cross-platform tools, the top 2 reasons were availability across platforms and development speed, that you want to cover all your bases, all your key platforms off, and you want to be fast enough, as close as speed to native. But then native UI support was not one of the hygiene factors. It was one of the differentiating factors. Which means that you use different tools if you want close to native or close to native like C++, close to native UI behavior, and a different set of tools, for example PhoneGap, if you don't care so much about, you know, native look and feel, but you want low cost 2 or 3 platforms to be covered out of the box, and you're a new startup, and you know, you want to keep your costs low. But your mileage may vary, your selection criteria may vary of cross-platform tools, but you're always going to be looking as a cross-platform developer for availability, close preference, and performance. And the native UI look and feel is going to be one of the differentiating factors. So it's not covered by all the tools. It's covered only by a few.
So you said it is a differentiating factor to have the native look and feel?
Exactly.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. To me, the only cross-platform solution that we have right now is the web. It's the only one that's available on every platform. It's the only one that's on every desktop, tablet, set-top boxes, everywhere. So, to me, I think also if you look at some of the top applications in any of the stores, you'll see that they all have their own distinctive UIs. Many apps do conform to the look and feel of the platform, but usually apps that are distinctive have their own look and feel. And if you're going for something where you're going to be deploying across multiple platforms, it doesn't always make sense to try and come up with a way to make each one look the same, but each one look like the target platform. The idea of cross-platform is you write it once and you don't have to keep writing it again for each platform. And so we've always advocated that developers try and create an application that has a look and feel that's distinctive for the application. Now that doesn't mean that there aren't parts of the application you should make look like the native platform. If you're creating a game, you're not going to make it look like an iOS application. It's going to be a game. You're going to have the menus are not going to look like iOS menus. And the same applies to many different types of applications. But you need to look at it on a case-by-case basis.
I agree with that, and I was going to say a slightly different take on it is I view it as almost a spectrum. On one side is a game where you want Angry Birds to look the same on every single device. That's what it's about, and they really don't care if the menus look different across devices. And then on the other side, imagine a completely data-driven business app where it's a bunch of text fields and things like that, and it would be probably disorienting if it didn't look like an Android device or an iOS device. There's a lot of space in the middle, and I think a lot of business apps are moving towards the making it a more attractive consumer gamified app in some ways, and that means that they may want to have distinctive UIs that are cross-platform.
If I could throw in one other thing, the worst crime than not matching the native UI is delivering an application that looks like another platform's UI. So if you deliver an Android application that looks like an iOS application, the Android users are not going to like that.
Well, and that brings up an interesting point too. I mean, there are a number of tools that allow you to, not a number. I mean, there are some that allow you to preserve the native UI of the application and share some code between the different platforms. But this is a difficult question for us because a lot of us are cross-platform development proponents or have tools, technologies, businesses built around cross-platform development. But does it ever make sense in some circumstances to build a discrete application for each platform? Or is it always perfect to use cross-platform, right?
Let me give you a perspective that I felt a bit shocked about. I was talking to an OEM, handset manufacturer yesterday, I won't name who they were, in the Bay Area, and they practically said to me that cross-platform tools are not for real developers. So real developers go native. And I would challenge that, but I want to hear the views of everybody here. I know what my views, but I'd be interested in hearing the views here.
Obviously, I don't agree with that. What I say is, you can do with any of these cross-platform tools, you can do the vast majority of what you'll need, and at the end of the day, it'll also come down to cost, right? And if you're running a business, whatever it is, like a game studio or an enterprise, whatever it is, if you have to contemplate building a from-scratch app for iOS, Android, alterations for Kindle and Nook, maybe do Windows soon and BlackBerry, it's untenable. So, you can try, but it's getting harder and harder.
For us, we kind of take the perspective it's application dependent. If you look in any one of the app stores, 30–40% are going to be games. I'd almost challenge why you wouldn't use a framework for producing games, right? So, from an overall app marketplace perspective, 40% of the time, it probably makes sense to use frameworks. The rest of the apps, it really, I think, depends on how much of it is logic is based in the UI versus what you can share on the back end. Because you have ways in which you could, whether using one of the frameworks or not, kind of encapsulate some of that logic, so you do have reuse. Because at the end of the day, when you look at so we have to, from a Microsoft perspective, part of my job is to increase the number of apps in the App Store. When I look across the breadth of things, and like I said, 40% games, obviously on the frameworks. The other ones where you have the top apps where, you want to have the most, the best experience across all the different devices. The cost to carry additional devices becomes prohibitive at some point, right? So in a 2-horse race right now, I like to think it's a 3-horse race, but if you look at iOS and Android, you're going to be, you can almost manage to have those two types of apps, but then you start to talk about Windows as we grow our ecosystem, as Kindle starts to grow its ecosystem. So if you want to bolt on these additional things, you have to look at some sort of framework option, but you're not going to be able to do it. So it's not necessarily do they work or don't they work, it's how are you going to be able to run a business without it? That's kind of how I would frame the question.
Let me just add one thing to that. One place where we've seen a challenge, at least in the audience, is that there's a lot of negativity around HTML5, for example, as a cross-platform development environment for gaming. People don't believe that performance is good, so a lot of people turn to native because of concerns about performance issues. So, we've solved that. I'm sure there's other companies in the world that are working on solving it, but, we have a platform where you can deliver a game. We're doing it this week to iOS, Google Play, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Facebook, Chrome, and Mozilla. So, I think, independent of what we all say, at the end of the day, most developers are looking for the simplest, fastest way to market on the most platforms, the most devices. And that's generally come down to one common look and feel, one platform solution. And I think more often than not, it's going to be the same look, the same feel, and that's going to win out all the time.
And I just add that I don't think there's any one right solution for every problem. And in some cases, you need to go native, and in some cases, you do not. And I think in many cases, you don't have to. But there may be things where, even if you're going with a cross-platform solution that involves HTML5, you may need some native components through something like PhoneGap to handle things like heavy image processing that you don't do on the back end. But you have to analyze your answer.
So Does anyone have any questions at this point? I know we were going to wait until the last 10 minutes, but I think it would be fair. We keep, putting some info out there. I'm sure some people are wondering some specifics. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand. Yes?
Performance issues by going one way or another. Like if I go native, is it faster in the things that I can do in a cross-platform environment?
I mean, we have a specific piece of code, a client virtual machine that we've created called Cocoon.js, and it takes the canvas command for HTML5 and maps it directly to OpenGL.ES. Very technical, sorry. But yes, the answer is yes. Of course, there is an advantage to going native unless you have some way to accelerate your performance. We provide that. Other people have worked on providing, it's kind of what I've been alluding to. But if you don't have that, and you want to do something like Angry Birds, it just won't work. You need some kind of accelerator for complex gaming, not for apps in general.
Yeah, I would say that for 90% of apps, you're sitting around waiting for the user to do something. These apps don't have, although apps are interactive, most of the time you're waiting on the user to do something, you respond to user events. I don't think there's a tremendous difference in performance between a native application and, say, a JavaScript-based application. There, obviously, as I said before, there are cases where this is not true. But I would say that it's not a big performance issue.
So, to add some research perspective numbers here. In the last survey we ran 3,500 developers. 75% of them use more than one platform, i.e. 2+ platforms. The numbers are coming down, so in 2010 it was an average of 3.2 platforms. Now it's an average of 2.6 platforms concurrently. So of course the Apple and Google duopoly are sort of making that happen. You can argue that as long as there's a duopoly, people can just dedicate themselves to two native platforms and don't need to go beyond that. And you see all of the startups, I mean all of the new apps on the apps on the Apple Store, you see them iOS app, Android app, and that's it. That's what their marketing goes out with. But we also see that we measured revenues per developer per app, and we saw the numbers really rapidly go up if you go 4 platforms plus, and that's because of reach. It's because of reach, but it's because of sophistication of the developer. So the more mature you are, the more of an infrastructure you have below you to be able to address those platforms, the more revenue per app per month you're going to make.
I'll actually add to that a little bit from a Windows perspective. We're seeing developers as they embrace our platform because of the lack of competition in the marketplace right now, the relative smaller size of apps in the marketplace. Those that are first to market are already making money as the platform grows. So as the new opportunities for developers are really in the new platforms that emerge, like around Windows Phone. I'll also say that one thing that we're doing at Microsoft that the other platforms aren't doing from a performance perspective is we actually support JavaScript and HTML5 as native development languages. So from a performance perspective, we see no difference whether you develop your app using basic web standards or if you do something like C# or C++. We actually did that specifically, so a lot of the framework partners that I work with, we see no degradation when running the frameworks inside of a Win.js component within Windows versus the other platforms. So we actually have a better story there.
And I'll say, just address the last thing, it's an outlier for it to show a lag in performance with our product, with Corona. It's OpenGL accelerated, and it's rare that a developer says it's running slowly. So it happens, but it's pretty rare in our experience.
Follow-up question.
I appreciate the stats there because benchmarks are important. So by the same token, can you provide benchmarks? I appreciate the fact that you say it's not, they don't see it that slow or slower. But I'd like to know if I run a piece of code, I don't know, I have 100 lines of code that draw a chart on my iPhone 5, and if I do it one way or another, is it 1.2%? The time it will take to run here? Is it 1-to-1? Is it twice as fast? Even if that's milliseconds, I'm trying to get some benchmarks because then I know in the grand scale of things, would it be different or not? And people who are in that space, the space you're in, means you provide these solutions, should probably be able to gauge these differences, and probably So I'm trying to find answers for that. Thank you.
I thing, a global benchmark is going to be a bunch of lies. Because you can't, it's apples and oranges you're comparing. So if you look at, you can't compare native with hybrid with mobile web to start with. They have very different approaches, they have very different pros and cons. You can't compare a tool that uses HTML to generate native with a tool that uses C++ to generate native, like Qt versus Accelerator. You just can't compare the two, right? Horses for courses, two different purposes. One's for enterprise, the other's for portability across 10+ platforms. You pick and choose. You have it works by verticals. So what are you trying to accomplish? Enterprise app versus game versus media authoring tool versus utility or something else. There's tools for that purpose. So just coming up with a number it's going to be really meaningless.
Again, more apps developers, less game developers, but in our world, 60 frames per second is a benchmark. So the human eye can't detect something beyond 60 frames per second that's material. So if you get to 60 frames per second, you've achieved what you want in a game in general. The more things that are happening on the screen at the same time, the more that starts to drop. And it depends on the iPad 3 versus the Nexus 1. It depends on 2.2 versus 4.x for Android. So absolutely, there's a derivative that has nothing to do with cross-platform tools specifically. We accelerate it, but we can only go so fast. It still has a lot to do with the operating system and performance of the platform. But 60 frames per second is a benchmark. So, and we can actually, if some people want to go over the booth later on, we can show you some demos that show you the difference between a 2.2 or 2.3 device and 4.x device, for example.
So, another question here.
Hi. So you talked about a lot of cross-platform games. Games also use in-application payments because a lot of virtual commerce is happening inside games. But the challenge there is with in-application payments, you find that on different platforms you have different SDKs, right? So even in the same platform like Android, for different marketplaces there are different SDKs. How can you give me a perspective on how are cross-platform tools solving that challenge of in-app monetization across platforms and marketplaces?
Go ahead.
Something I'm talking about. I'll give you the Corona perspective. We support in-app purchases on iOS, on Google Play, on Amazon very soon. Nope, doesn't have in-app purchases yet. So not only do we support across the platforms that have it, but we actually try to go the next step, and we have a common, I think it's called a store API. And so what we try to do is just use the same API, and Corona figures out what to do for each different platform. So it's not only we enable it on all of them, you use the same thing. And they all work differently in the background, right? And you have to worry about the different ways of doing certificates and receipts and all sorts of stuff. And that's what we do.
And they copied us, because we do exactly the same thing. But there's a couple of other issues. There are a lot of different SDKs. For example, native ad networks. I think one of the challenges we have across platform is exactly that. There's so many SDKs for haptics, for example, or for push notifications, or for analytics. And the challenge that we face is that the developers focused for the last 5 years, those developers that build those platforms, haptics, etc., focused on native SDKs, native ad network SDKs. So really, we need more and more, JavaScript-oriented, or in our case, JavaScript-oriented SDKs. We also are about to open up our platform so people can build their own extensions to the platform. Then they can offer that to our developer base, which is a big base. So, but that is a big issue. It's a very good question.
Well, and I think that part of the question was for Android specifically, where Android, if anyone was developing before Android 3, and all of a sudden 3 came out, you just switched to fragments, and then kind of they added more UI components, and everyone wants to use the new UI components for 4, and there's a compatibility library, but it doesn't work on the new version quite right. Some of that, for a lot of the cross-platform approaches, that just doesn't matter, because we're not, a lot of tools, frameworks just don't even use those, don't even utilize those things, but some do, and I think that it's a platform per platform basis. I think different people take different companies take different approaches to solving that kind of a problem. So,
just say one more thing. I mean, I don't think we really answered your question. Cross-platform monetization is a problem, period. You know, Apple has payments, Google has payments. So what we've done together is given you a single API to write to for in-app payments. That doesn't solve virtual currency, things like that. So there's a lot of work that has to be done, particularly in discovery and monetization space. There's so many companies out there. It's an unbelievably fragmented market. So just take away their payments and their payments, Barnes & Noble, and everybody else's. There's other issues, discovery and monetization issues. I think we're looking for a single solution that we can offer our developer base as it presented to us.
Any more questions? Right here.
Hello. Yeah. So I have a question about the way like these hybrid apps or the non-native apps are getting approved or disapproved. So obviously these app makers like Google and Apple, they want the developers to use their own SDKs. And when you develop a hybrid app or a non-native app, do you guys see any particular pattern in the way these apps are getting approved or disapproved?
We're talking Apple App Store rejection, right? Because I mean Google doesn't really reject. Right.
I'll take a quick stab at it. You might be referring to, I think it was 3 years ago or sometime 2009, or I don't even know when it was. There was a brief period where there were some issues, potential issues. It got resolved. It is quite frankly a non-issue right now. Corona has over 25,000 apps, Corona-made apps on all the app stores. They don't get rejected because they're Corona or anything. And the way our architecture looks, it looks very similar to, for example, the way our Angry Birds architecture is. It's Lua on top of virtual machine, all this stuff. There's no reason for them to reject it, and it's just not happening.
Yes, let me run over to you here.
Are there any other cross-compiler, cross-platform compilers like Kony? Where Kony?
Chloe?
Kony cross-platform compilers? Any others? Any competitors?
Okay, so Kony I've put in the sector of enterprise-focused tools, and that's Accelerator. It's a Marin. It's AnyPresence. There's a couple more which I can't remember, but there's like at least 6 or 7 cross-platform tools specifically niching themselves to enterprise. And that's because they pretty much figured out that the money's in the enterprise, not just, they can't do good enough games, frameworks, because Unity and Unreal are there and they have the market share. So they figured out where the money is, it's in enterprise, so there's a bunch of vendors that were generic CPTs and now they're focused on enterprise.
And I'd say that in principle, it's the same idea, right? I mean, I think that Kony and Accelerator and a couple other iFactor, they're great for very data-driven apps. And they probably have all sorts of SAP connectors and things like that, right? And that's great for enterprise and it's very important. We don't have any SAP connectors. You can do business apps with us. And like I said earlier, as you see business apps migrate towards more interactive and rich apps, we think we're in a great position, but it is a different market. But the underlying technology is similar, same idea.
Would it be okay leveraging that?
So if I understand the question, you're saying, are you talking about integrating Facebook with a cross-platform app, or are you talking about building an app on Facebook and using that as the cross-platform app? Integrate. So you're asking if there are problems, is it suitable to integrate cross-platform? All right, anyone want to answer that? Is it suitable to integrate with Facebook on a cross-platform app?
Sure. I mean, we have Facebook APIs cross-platform built in. So you want to use Facebook login or Facebook posting, that's no problem. I mean, that's a relatively easily addressed issue. It's been addressed for quite a while.
And I think what you were asking the first time is consumer versus business apps. We definitely see it much more on consumer apps, games. When people want to integrate Facebook and be able to share stuff with friends and things like that. I think it's rarer on the business side, but yeah, it's very doable for us as well.
So it sounds like no problems there. More questions?
Thank you very much for all the perspectives. As a dabbler in game development, let's say you guys are offering collectively, just not picking anyone, 3 to 4 platforms, maybe top 5 right now. So if there is a new platform, whatever it's called, Timbuktu, let's say, And how easy would it be for me to expose my app on that new platform? Do I get that support right off the bat from a cross-platform tool, or should I upgrade as a new service? Is my question straightforward?
Yeah, I'd say very frankly, that's probably one of the, I guess it's a disadvantage of going with a cross-platform tool. In our case, we don't yet support Windows. We can do that, we'll probably do it, but we'd have to do it for you to be able to publish to Windows. Once we do it, it's great, you can use a single code base, now you have Windows too, but until we do it, you can't publish to Windows, you'd have to do it.
Well, yeah, it's one of the best and worst parts, right? Like, until a platform exposes, like for our products, like we need them to give us a C++ toolchain and SDK, then we can support it, right? But if they don't do that, like the original Windows Phone, they said no native apps like that. So you have to use managed C#, right? And so a lot of engines couldn't go on it. They had to use XNA, and it was not going to work. Which is not a yes, and which we appreciate. Other insights?
Yeah, I was just going to say that's one of the reasons why we're pushing the web as a platform, is because I don't think you're going to see any new platform come out that's not web-based right now. If you look at Firefox OS and Ubuntu, all of these platforms support web as a native solution. And so that's why we feel like a JavaScript HTML5 CSS approach insures you against getting stuck inside of an app store. If your app can run in a browser, whether it be a web view within an app or served from the mobile web, then you're not stuck.
You're saying it's a form of future-proofing.
Yes.
Oh,
yeah,
sorry.
The thing with the duopoly, let's add Microsoft and Ring to that. So with the stabilization of the four platforms, what you're seeing is there is cross-platform tool diversity, not on the deployment side, i.e. which platforms are you going to support, but on the development side. So most notably, the biggest trend we've seen is addition of HTML/JavaScript, either or both, within cross-platform tools. So opening up the gates to web developers to target those platforms. So the differentiation now is coming on the development side, which languages / high-level design frameworks are you going to support, but not on which underlying natives are you going to support, because that's pretty much stabilized.
All I want to say is that I agree with what he said and what everybody else said. That, the issue we have with Microsoft is kind of going away because of their migration to aggressive support for HTML5 and JavaScript. Tizen, Intel, and Samsung is coming out. It's an HTML5 based operating system. Mozilla is an HTML5 based operating system. So what he said, future-proofing, is exactly, I think, the place that we see. And for game development, we think HTML5 is the answer, because it'll get you everywhere ultimately. Wrapping it is the challenge. Putting it on the web, you don't get the performance you need in most cases. But wrapping it is a challenge we have to deal with Tizen. Packaging, giving you a package for Amazon with the Amazon payments inside of it correctly, or any Amazon uniqueness that we have to derive from the platform to give to you as a single API, for example.
I was going to say, that's completely fair. With HTML5, yeah, you will run out of the box, I guess, on any platforms. You won't get to take advantage of the App Store and the distribution and things like that in certain ways, but there's always trade-offs.
I was just going to add that what he was saying is absolutely right. When we look at evangelizing to developers, we no longer talk about use C#, use JS, use this. We say, what frameworks are you using today? What platforms are you targeting today? We typically divide our efforts in that respect. So we recognize that kind of the developer choice has gone up the stack. So we debate between use a framework or use native. Even once you get into the native world, there still is this element of you need to find the building blocks that are going to make things cost efficient and make yourself productive. And honestly, that's where we target. Right? We don't actually go down to the metal anymore when we talk about what's going to run on Windows and what doesn't. We talk about those frameworks.
So I have a question for Microsoft. So I love the Metro UI, right? But how much? And my phone is a Windows Phone 8, but it's both a panacea, it's both a blessing and a curse, because I'm sure you've seen probably the majority of your developers struggle with a new UX just because it's new. So how much, I mean, of course it's fresh, but how much of a problem has that been?
Yeah, so we have actually it's an interesting. We at first you have issues with developers just kind of understanding, oh, I have to fit into a design paradigm, right? So it's getting developers to feel comfortable having to be in that mold. But once they understood it, it kind of frees them from a lot of decisions, right? Because we do a lot of heavy lifting for you to make your app look good. It's part of the reason why we did it. And actually, it's funny to go back and forth where this all kind of came from, us understanding a consistent look and feel across different apps, is we ran into this issue on Xbox. So we started to do native apps on Xbox for different media partners. And you can imagine it quickly became a nightmare when CBS wanted to have their volume control over here and NBC wanted to do it a little bit different, so on and so forth. And it just was a completely jarring experience. So we wanted to make it almost like flipping channels on the platform, and so it was a consistent feel for all the different users. So once we talked to designers and developers about that, and we give them that framework and that place to put it in, they love it. They love it when they're first developing that. The hardest thing for us to do is going into an existing brand and have them retrofit it. I always say it's the problem of trying to make a Dunkin' Donuts look like it works in Colonial Williamsburg, right? Like you just have to, that becomes a little bit of an issue, but honestly it's, the model sets you free a little bit.
Hey Harry, I hate to cut you short and I apologize, but we are out of time here. So I would like to thank all the panelists for coming out today, spending their time with us. And if you guys could give them a round of applause, that'd be great.